Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Charles Ebinger, the Director of the Energy Security Initiative here at Brookings. And on behalf of Brookings, we're delighted to welcome our distinguished panel today. I don't think the panel needs an extended introduction, so I'm not going to make one, but we, of course, have Jim Rogers, who's just recently stepped down as the head of Duke Energy. Jim has been a leader in the field for many, many years, and I'm also delighted to note that he is a trustee of the Brookings Institution, which we are delighted. Next to him is Mike Cheshire, former CEO of Great Plains Energy, Kansas City-based utility, and a leader having been on the board of directors of EPRI and a whole host of utility institutions. I think a man who was noted when he was CEO for paying special attention to, not that they don't all do this, but a special attention to the needs of his consumers, and having won great praise from a number of groups in his service territory for the leadership role he took on many positions. And then Ron Binz, who I'm also delighted, along with Mike, to note that he also has recently agreed to be a non-resident senior fellow of Brookings. Long-standing background in Colorado, and especially noted in his regulatory capacity. Of course, most recently, unfortunately, nominated to become the new chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, but in the wisdom of our wonderful Congress, he unfortunately was not confirmed in that position, but is now serving as a private consultant to a number of utility clients. The format today will be that I will make just some very brief introductory comments, setting the stage for where we want to go today. Then each of them will have 7 or so minutes to kind of highlight some of the challenges they see confronting the industry. But the purpose today is really to hear from you. This is designed to be a free-flowing forum with questions from you about the future of the utility industry, things that are of concern to you or points you want to make. I do ask, when you do make a question, please make sure it is a question with kind of a question mark at the end. And we ask before you ask your question, if you would please make sure you identify yourself. We are being webcast for the event today, and we are also on Twitter. And the feed, if you want to know that, is FP Energy is the hashtag. It's hard to believe that it was nearly, if my math is good, 36 years ago that we had the passage of the PURPA legislation, which of course for the first time assailed the historic role of monopoly utilities in the United States by introducing the concept of independent power generation. And since then, of course, through a number of FERC orders and a variety of other pieces of legislation, we have seen, of course, the transmission sector also torn asunder with the development in some markets, at least, of ISOs and TSOs. And now we are at the point where we see utility distribution also, traditional modes of utility distribution also coming under assault under the rubric of distributed generation with things such as rooftop solar and other forms of DG. Clearly, the utility industry is under great challenges. As Jim was reminding us at lunch, by 2050, nearly 70% of the current non-carbon emitting, I think I'm quoting you right, non-carbon emitting generation plants have to be replaced at a prodigious potential cost, since of course a lot of the plants that will be replaced, as well as of course coal-fired, a lot of coal-fired generation, a lot of these plants are of course have already had their capital structure written down, so they're going to be replaced very likely by new plants that will have a higher, albeit different capital structure. So we have a number of questions before us today, and without further ado, I will turn it over first to Ron Binz to make some remarks, and I've asked him particularly, he doesn't have to do it right now, but during the course of the discussion, key question mark is, does the traditional mode of utility regulation fit the changes that are occurring in this tumultuous industry? Ron?
Thank you, Charlie, and hello, everybody. I see lots of friends in the audience. Thank you for being here. Let me begin by saying I acknowledge that I'm from Denver, Colorado. I acknowledge that there was a big football game on Sunday, and so I've heard, and I would choose not to talk about it. The subject we're on today is huge. It's very complicated. It's even hard to define the terms around it. But when we're approaching the utility of the future, I like to ask each of us to think about what the grid of the future is going to look like. So let's go out far enough that we can jump over today's current controversies about $5 natural gas this week when it was only $3 6 weeks ago or something like that. Let's just skip over that. What's the grid going to look like 20 or 30 years from now? There are certain characteristics, I think, which we will agree on. One is that it will be low carbon. I know there's a religious debate in this country about the reality of climate change, whether it's anthropomorphic and so forth and so on. I'm asking you, if you have to, actually, if this becomes belief for you, that's okay, but just move out 30 years and imagine a grid in which the electricity generated and consumed is zero or near zero carbon on average. The second thing that I'm going to ask you to imagine is it will be a connected, webbed grid in much the same way that the internet is today. I believe that the application of IP technology to the electric grid will transform electric consumption in a parallel but different way than the way the internet has remade news gathering, entertainment, purchasing, banking, about anything we do. Just think how fundamentally the IP technology has changed that. A similar transformation will happen in electricity, although we can't always decide what that will look like. It will happen. So today you hear about the smart grid. You can set your thermometer in your house, your thermostat in your house while driving your car and talking to your wireless connection to your grid. That sounds kind of corny or hokey, and I agree that it is. You can't justify an overhaul of the grid from the ability of being able to change your thermostat from your car. But on the other hand, if you imagine that every device in the network, every refrigerator, every hot water heater, every generating plant, every steel mill is communicating with every other thing, including some central orchestrator who makes all of this work together. If that's the image that you hold of the grid of the future, then you can start backing up from that and deciding what kinds of changes are going to be required to get there. So I'm going to just mention in my 7 minutes here a few of the characteristics of that grid and begin to back into the implications for today's actors, today's utilities, today's financiers in that market, and today's consumers in that market. If you believe that the grid will be clean with respect to emissions, and I mean here mostly carbon dioxide emissions, although others are included as well, you have to admit or acknowledge the presence of large amounts of low carbon resources, and that generally, although not exclusively, means renewable energy. Renewable energy comes with the characteristic of interruptibility or non-constants, and that must imply that the grid is able to absorb those kinds of inputs. That will be a grid with significant amounts of storage, but also price-responsive demand. So those are the kinds of things which we have not historically thought of the grid as being able to do. Baseload generation of today is notoriously inflexible, especially coal and nuclear. They're inflexible. They are not able to respond quickly, or at least to the degree to which we will need to absorb intermittent resources like large amounts of wind and solar. Now, oftentimes today, intermittent resources are cast as a problem. The sun doesn't always shine. How many of you ever heard that as someone who's discounting the future of solar? The wind doesn't always blow. Well, that's not news to anybody, including all the engineers of the utilities who are learning how to grapple with that. So it's a characteristic, but I wouldn't consider it to be a block on any of these technologies happening. Xcel Energy in Colorado is doing a magnificent job of balancing a system with an 8,000 megawatt peak with 2,200 megawatts of wind. They've learned how to run a system using that. Now, Colorado is not even connected to the other states in any serious degree. It's kind of an island that way, not much transfer capacity. The utility of the future, the orchestra leader of the future, is going to learn how to balance an entirely different sort of grid, one where you've got very many inputs. I mentioned earlier water heaters and freezers. Why did I mention those? Because those are variable demand, and they can actually be shaped. They can be brought on when you need demand, and they can be turned off when you don't need demand. Imagine aggregating all of the freezers and electric water heaters, and for that matter, thermal space conditioning in the country. That becomes effectively a very giant battery, which you can put in power or take out power. So that's the image that you need to think about. Today's utilities are a long way from that reality. And as I will talk about later, today's regulation gives very little incentive to utilities to evolve in the way society needs for them to evolve. I'm a former regulator, and I'm kind of like a former smoker. Okay? I'm very passionate about the shortcomings of today's regulation, and I've got a lot of ideas about where it might go, and that's a large part of what my consulting practice is dedicated to. Bottom line, society needs to regulate utilities with an eye towards motivating them to do the things that society wants out of them. That's a pretty obvious concept, but a very novel one when it comes to utility regulation. Thank you, Charlie. I appreciate it. I look forward to discussion with these two fine gentlemen to my left, although they're actually on my right.
Far right.
Mike?
Well, first of all, Ron, I want you to know, don't feel so bad. I'm from Baltimore, and we didn't even make the playoffs this year after winning the Super Bowl, so I'm not sure who should feel worse. I have to say, you know, the title really of the seminar is The Future of Electric Utilities. And I have to say, having spent most of my career with 4 or 5 different utilities, I come down very optimistic about the potential for utilities to not only thrive, but to also evolve into a more exciting kind of a company. You know, we were talking at lunch. You know, one of the fellows at lunch said, "So, how do you attract people into a utility today in this uncertain world where we're not sure where they're going, what the financial health is going to be, and so forth?" And I say I've never had an easier time attracting the best and the brightest because of the world that Ron just described. I mean, think about moving from a one-way system to a two-way integrated network and all the software and the communications and the electronics, and people are you know, coming out of college really excited about participating in that. And so to me, I think the key will be, and this is a fundamental belief that I have, is companies that succeed over the long term have a sense of a higher purpose. You know, they're not just looking at earnings next quarter or earnings next year, but they're thinking about, you know, how can we make the world better? And that's sort of been the legacy of utilities for over 125 years. Always looking for ways to improve the life of our customers, always looking for ways to improve the community, the economic development, the environment, even the low-income challenges that communities have. So if utilities keep a focus on that as we go into this new world, then I think they're going to succeed. Obviously, they're going to have to change the way they approach the marketplace. They're going to have to recognize, focusing on the customer, that there are people out there that have better value propositions to offer than utilities do, with distributed generators, energy service companies, those type of services. But on the other hand, there are customers that really want to get those services from their local utility. They trust the brand, they trust the reliability. So it's not really an either-or situation, but utilities have to be much more inclusive in how they approach the business. The other thing that I think is interesting is there are going to be lots of opportunities for utilities to provide services that maybe they uniquely are going to be able to provide. The classic example that, as we've seen play out over the last 5 to 7 years, is raising funds and capital in the public markets to fund energy efficiency in our buildings. There's huge potential, still untapped potential, for improving the efficiency of our buildings. In fact, I was hearing the other day from someone at the NRDC, they did a study in a city that said two buildings side by side that look exactly alike, have the same use. One uses 2 to 3 times the power that the other does. And if you look at all the avoided costs, avoided generation costs, the environmental benefits and so forth, energy efficiency should really be our first fuel of choice. And utilities are uniquely positioned to help advance that, raise capital, and earn a return on that capital. Another somewhat less obvious solution, but again, it gives you a flavor of how utilities can play in this future market, is what I call community solar. So right now, there's a lot of people putting solars on the roof, and they're incurring the cost of installing it, the maintenance, all of that. There's another way to approach that, where a utility would find a spot on their system that needed to be reinforced, expanded substation, new feeders, and so forth, and instead install an array of photovoltaic cells, maybe 50 megawatts. And there's technology available today where the utility could carve out a specific cell and have that be attributed to an individual residential customer and basically lease that cell to them, credit their bill for every kilowatt that's generated by that cell at 70% of the cost and all the avoided headaches of rooftop solar. So again, that's just an example of some of the ways that utilities going forward, being innovative, can participate. I think the grid, as we talked about, is going to be a huge enabler. It's going to play out over time. It's not going to happen overnight. And it's going to cost quite a bit to make this transition. I mean, when you're thinking about going, all the software, all the communications, all the electronic devices that have to be brought to bear to make it truly a two-way integrated network, and you combine that with the fact that, like all of America's infrastructure, the grid is aging. A transformer manufacturer told me the other day that the average age of a transformer in an American substation today is 40 years. That we depreciate them over 30 years. They're not intended to operate that much longer. So we have all of those costs, embedded costs, that are going to have to be phased in over time. And it's going to be very important that all the participants, including the distributed generators, participate in paying for that cost. So bottom line, the big question is, in this kind of a world, how are utilities going to make money? What's going to be the financial health of utilities as we go through this kind of a transition? And I believe if we're true to that higher purpose of focusing on what's best for our customers and what's best for the community, and we're seen as doing that, then in the end we'll be treated fairly. I mean, there's a traditional utility process that I think still will apply as we go forward. And think of it as 3 concentric circles. So in the center, you have the customer and the community. If you truly are doing a good job in taking care of them, then the middle circle, the political circle, the media, other stakeholders will appreciate and recognize that. And then once that equity is built up, regulators will respond and want the utility to stay in business and earn a fair return. Two quick examples. Back in KCP&L, back in the 2005 timeframe, regulators were actually asking us to build a coal-fired plant, if you can believe that. That's that recently. And we needed the capacity in the region, and we were the ones that were financially able to do that. But rather than just take the instruction from the regulator and say, okay, we'll go do it, we decided, well, let's have a community conversation. And we brought in everybody. We brought in low-income advocates, which, by the way, I am, hopefully we'll talk about this later, I believe that the lost customer in all of this conversation is the single mother who wakes up every morning trying to decide whether she's going to pay her electric bill or put food on the table. That's, again, part of the higher purpose that the utility has to focus on as it works its strategy. But anyway, so we brought them in, we brought the environmentalists, we brought politicians, technologists, and we had a year-long community conversation. And coming out of that was a comprehensive energy plan that was bought into by all those constituents and supported by the newspaper. And it required significant investments building the coal plant, retrofitting some of our existing plants, building energy efficiency, building wind. Rates went up 40%, and we were able to achieve that, pass that through. And today, we're getting a reasonable return on all those investments. But we only did it because the community believed that this was something that was in the collective best interest of the community instead of something that was dreamt up by utility planners in a back room. We did something very similar with energy efficiency, where we are now going to the market, raising capital with the support of all those constituents and helping buildings retrofit and homeowners retrofit their buildings. So, that kind of an approach, a different mindset for utilities, folk driven by their higher purpose, is what I think is going to allow utilities to continue to thrive as we build out this new world that Ron talked about.
Thank you, Mike. Jim?
Good afternoon. I'm going to start out by simply saying I agree with everything that's been said, but I want to put my spin on it.
Here we go.
And my spin goes like this. I'd ask you to think in a more macro way for a moment. If you look at demand for electricity in the United States today, it is essentially flat across the country. Some would say anemic growth. You could make a case there's actually going to be a decline in the use of electricity, even though we're continuing to do electrification of more processes in the country. But when you look at the new technologies, there's huge productivity gains in the production, in the delivery, and in the use of electricity. So I think one macro challenge that we all have to think about as we think about the future is a flat to declining demand. There's been a decoupling of the growth in demand for electricity from growth in GDP for the first time in our history. And I can talk more about that if you would like. But that has decoupled and is going to have profound implications for the way forward. The second thing is what Charlie referenced, is by 2050, virtually every power plant in this country, with the exception of our hydro plants, and assuming they don't extend the license for nuclear from 60 years to 80 years, are going to be retired and replaced. It's almost a virtual blank sheet of paper in terms of how do we design the generation mix going forward. Now, the significance of that is, if you believe that climate is a problem, and I do, is that if we shut down the nuclear fleet in the United States, that represents 70% of the carbon-free electricity. And the question is, what are you going to replace it with? Are you going to replace it with nuclear? Are you going to replace it? We have an abundance of shale gas, which has 50% of the carbon of coal, significantly more emissions than nuclear. And so one of the big challenges and question marks is as we redesign the generation fleet in this country, what will the mix be? And how will we incent the building of the mix? Because the power sector is the most capital-intensive industry in the United States. And as a consequence, we have to attract significant capital in order to replace this generation fleet. The second thing I would say is, really, third point, declining demand, retire, replace all the generation, is that there is a wave of technology that's transforming every aspect of our business. I see technologies today that could reduce our line loss, which is high as 8 to 9%, could drop it to 2%. That would be a significant savings going forward for consumers if that can get done. I see efforts to transform our grid from analog to digital. That won't happen overnight, as Mike was saying. But at the end of the day, going to digital simply means we have two-way communication. We'll be able to operate our system more efficiently. We'll be able to do proactive maintenance, which will improve our reliability, which today is about 99.9% of the time we provide electricity. So the reality is this sweep of technology is huge. And it really gets to Ron's point. I think the Internet of Everything will transform the use of electricity in the United States. I think the simple fact that Google acquired Nest tells you where it's going. Because at the end of the day, what Nest is going to do is write the software for every device within the home. And that's going to lead to an optimization of the use of electricity within every home, and I suspect every business. Now, is the utility industry equipped to handle all this? And the reality is that you go back to when regulation was first established to attract the capital to provide universal access to our country. Back in the 20s, it was designed for us to build out to every home, to every farm, and the co-ops were developed primarily to go into rural areas, but we had the capability to provide universal access, and in the 20th century, the National Academy of Engineers said it was the single greatest engineering achievement. Not the internet, not the iPhone, not a man on the moon. You go through the list, but it was the single greatest engineering achievement. Now, what we do in the 21st century will be different, but not significantly different. Today, we are a battery. We have tens of millions of customers making random decisions every second, turning lights on, turning on their TV, turning on radios, and we handle that because we have an infrastructure that acts like a battery. We're always there. We instantaneously respond to the random decisions of millions. But what we haven't developed yet is a capability to deal with a generation fleet with hundreds of generators, because we've had a central station approach. And with distributed generation, that will change. But our ability to balance, to optimize on the supply side and the demand side, we can do it because we've been doing it on the demand side for a very long time. So I envision we'll be a battery, and it'll be a greater challenge for us in terms of optimization, but we will continue to optimize. Here's the big difference, and this is where regulation is going to have to change. This might be where Ron pushes back on me. Today, regulations allows us to optimize from the generation to the meter. I believe to get maximum efficiency out of the grid tomorrow, we need to have the capability as a utility to optimize from the generation, whether it's a central station or distributed gen, all the way to the device. It's in that optimization that there will be even greater productivity gains, more downward pressure on demand going forward, And that's going to require for us to make these billions of dollars investment to go from analog to digital, to replace the existing generation, although it would be a different mix. We're going to have to raise a significant amount of capital to do that. And we need to do it at the lowest cost because it translates into lower prices for our customers. We can do that, but we have to have a regulatory model, not the one we had the day that was built in the 20s to provide universal access, but one built today that incents us to really accelerate our role as the battery, to accelerate our role as the optimizer. That, to me, is the model. And it's, to me, I call it decoupling on steroids. And what I mean by that is it's moving all the way to a formula rate approach, so with incentives built in for us to optimize and produce productivity gains in the use of electricity. Thank y'all very much.
Do anybody want to comment on each?
Yeah, I want to know how Jim was looking at my notes here. On that last point, I think absolutely. I wrote myself a question because it kind of came out of what I was hearing. How are utilities going to make money in the new world? I think it's going to be, by the way, we have sitting in the front row the author of Smart Power, Peter Fox-Penner, who 3 years ago made clear that one of the modes of progress for utilities was to become an energy services company, provide to the customers not necessarily kilowatt hours, although that might be part of what they do, but more generally energy services. I get completely with that. And to your point, Jim, I think utilities need to start looking at getting on the other side of the meter for distributed generation. I think Mike's idea of utilities building solar gardens is a good one, but they need to know that's going to be in competition for other people doing that. That's okay. I mean, not only is that okay, that's a good thing. So utilities have been very hesitant to get on the other side of the meter. They have put all their effort into fighting net energy metering tariffs around the country. That's been their response, as everybody knows. And I think that getting on the other side of the meter, both respect to generation like distributed generation, but also in offering energy efficiency services to customers. The largest single load is electric lighting in this country. And lighting, as we all know, is hugely inefficient, including the bulbs in this room. Those are the kinds of low-hanging fruit which are, for a lot of reasons, still subject to so much economic friction that they're not happening. But I think the utilities need to embrace that. Now, absolutely, their revenue model, their regulated revenue model, has to change in order to accommodate that. You can't simultaneously sell electrons and not sell electrons and expect to come out in the end. So Jim and I are in complete agreement with that. The only caveat I have, if any, Jim, with what you just said, is that you said we need to push this optimization to the device. I agree, but we might mean a whole lot of we's, not just electric utilities.
Let me kind of respond quickly because you left the impression, Ron, that somehow utilities, and I know Mike is thinking the same thing I am, utilities have been reluctant to go on the other side of the meter and help their customers reduce their usage. Well, heck, we've been doing that for over 20, 25 years, helping with demand side management, investing on the other side of the meter. You know what the number one roadblock for us is? Is a regulator. And I can give you examples of states where they basically have an independent third party do the energy efficiency, but only allow us to do the difficult part. So they take it away from us. I've been in other states where we've, in virtually every state, Duke tried to put Save-A-Watt in place. We're required under PURPA to buy electricity at avoided cost. And our simple proposal was allow us to earn for every megawatt we can reduce the same as the avoided cost of buying a new one. There was a symmetry to that. There was a beauty to that. But guess what? By the time it went through the regulatory process, we didn't get that incentive to invest on the other side. They went back to lost revenues. They went back to ideas from 20 years ago. So the regulators didn't kind of modernize their thinking. to give us the incentive to go the other side. They reduced our incentive, yet they still require us to buy electricity from PURPA machines at avoided costs, but they give us much less than the equivalent for every megawatt that we save. They gave us much less for producing that result. So part of the problem in us being able to compete on the energy services, our ability to put solar on the rooftop, we got regulatory approval to do that in North Carolina. But that was 4 or 5 years ago. I bet today there would be people trying to block us from doing that. Regulators don't necessarily want the utility to be competing with all the new entrants coming into the market, and they're trying to structure the rule to keep us from competing because they know we're effective and a low cost when we jump into the market. And the last simple point is we made the decision 5 years ago to start building solar and wind. And we've invested over $3 billion. We have built 2,000 megawatts of wind and solar in other regions of the country. We've been a seller, not necessarily a buyer, because we were waiting to buy when the prices came down, the technology improved, because at the end of the day, being affordable really matters to our customers. So we've been focused on selling renewables to other utilities in the country, utility scale. We've even looked at doing solar on the rooftop, but those are primarily in states where the utilities are required to buy. So we're not sleeping at the switch in terms of building, and our ability to attract capital is great and at low cost. But the impediment is really the regulators in trying to keep us from competing with the new entrants that are moving into the market.
So let me pick up on that. First of all, I think the key here is execution. I mean, we can all paint what the world's going to look like, but how do you actually implement and execute as a utility and as all the participants? Well, we've been planning the distributed utility models, I was talking at lunch, since the mid-'80s, and we still have a long way to go in terms of actually getting things that make economic sense and also avoiding cross-subsidization. Today, in a lot of the states, distributed generators are taking full advantage of the grid, but they're not paying for the benefits that they get from the grid, the backup power, the power quality, and so forth. So obviously, their business model looks pretty good, and their margins are pretty good when you don't have to pay the full freight. But that single mom putting food on the table is subsidizing that, which isn't going to be a sustainable model. So we have to figure out a way, how do we go through and execute this on a sustainable way? And the other thing I will say, picking up on Jim's point and working with the regulators, I'm a big believer, as I said before, if you can work at it, and it takes a long time, a year, 2 years, 3 years in the case of our energy efficiency program. But if you can build a community consensus around what makes sense and get, in the case of Missouri, one of the most conservative states in the union, we actually had legislation that was passed that basically said utilities, as they raise capital for energy efficiency, should be able to earn the same return on that they earn if they were building a power plant, and taking into account lost revenue and everything else. But we got that because we had the NRDC, the Sierra Club, the low-income advocates, the businesses, all there working and supporting that legislation. Now, once you have that and you go to the regulator, the regulator is sitting there and say that, well, there's a groundswell of community support around this. They see that even though the utility is making money, they're bringing superior benefits to the community. This makes sense. So it's a different model than we traditionally, way we've worked with regulators or worked with distributed generators, but it's one that I think will work going forward.
I'd like to throw out, and then we'll rapidly get to the audience. But I think you've all done a great job talking about kind of the state of the industry, declining demand, very likely rising capital costs. I'm amazed when you say you could get a 40% rate and your consumers supported you on that. But there are a lot of other things going on. I'd just like all of you to ruminate, how do we make this transition that I think you're all supporting and talking about towards more distributed generation when we really don't know what our carbon policy is going to be. And as I think Jim or somebody said at lunch, when you replace one of the plants that you have to take down, you're talking about an investment that may be there 30 years, or if it's a nuclear plant, maybe there longer. In the wake of the extreme weather events we seem to be having more frequently, there's a lot of talk about grid resiliency and reliability, people saying we ought to put wires underneath the ground to the extent we still have wires in the future. But is a small distributed generation facility capable of financing that kind of investment if they're putting it along the New Jersey coast, for example? We haven't touched upon, but the whole issue of both physical security and cyber security. I'd be interested, maybe if we have all these components tied to an internet-like device, if something happens, we're able to cut it off and limit it. But on the other hand, is there a danger as we're more interlinked that a cybersecurity event is more likely to be catastrophic than if we have a more diversified system? So and finally, I guess it's a little off track of those events, but finally I asked the question, how is our federal regulatory process need to be refined? Because if what we're really talking about is probably maybe less power being transmitted maybe that's not what you're saying. But if we're talking about less power really going across state lines because we have more localized systems, is the whole structure of FERC and the whole way we regulate the system today adequate, or does it need to be completely revamped or rethought?
Well, let me start. I'll leave the FERC to you guys, since you both had a lot of experience working with that. But just on a basic level, I currently live in an area that I used to run there before I left to other communities. I actually operated the power system in the area that I live in now. And in those days, I refused to buy a backup generator. I said, nobody should have to buy a backup generator. The utilities ought to be able to provide the kind of power that is needed and be relied on, and if we're not doing it, we're failing in our mission. 15 years later, I moved back into this area, and the first thing I did was buy a backup generator. Because the power quality needs today are so far superior. I mean, today, I'm completely shut down in any business that I'm trying to do, in any of their lifestyle issues, if I don't have continuous power. The grid, as we build it out, as we envision it, has the potential to fill that need. There's elements of self-healing aspects where it can detect a fault out on the line and reroute the power to make sure that the power comes back to meet our customers' future needs. But on the other hand, the people living in the inner city are not willing to pay for that. They can't afford to pay for that. So we're going to have to find a way to provide each type of customer what they need and make sure that they're paying their fair share for that. But I think cybersecurity ties into that as well, because right now today there is a real concern that the power system, computer systems can be invaded and scrambled, and transformers can be damaged. So the more real-time intelligence you have with the grid, the more you'll be able to avoid that. But today, if you would speak to the Department of Energy or Department of Homeland Security, the grid is probably one of their biggest concerns as far as cybersecurity.
Let me address the issue of climate. I mean, we need a price on carbon. I mean, we came very close in 2009 in terms of passing the House, but not the Senate. I think that would be very important to have a price on carbon. But here's one of the realities for a power supplier that's building new plants. When we do our integrated resource plan, we always put a price on carbon. We put multiple prices on carbon to test the robustness of the alternatives that we're looking at as we make our decision to build a new plant. So we operate with the assumption that there will be a price. If you build a nuclear plant for 60 years, there is going to be a price on carbon in the next 60 years. I think this is a problem that our country needs to address. I'm not sure I'll be around for the price, but you have to plan assuming that if you're a prudent operator and a prudent builder, that there will be a price on carbon. So I think that is just a given. On cyber, I would say this. Going to a digital grid might expose us even more than the analog to cyber attack. But at the end of the day, we have to work closely with the Department of Defense and with Homeland Security to get this right. They understand the cyber issues much better than we do, and our industry is working side by side with them to try to be lockstep in protecting the grid. The tough part of this is that, microgrids will play a role. Today, it's not just cyber attack, but there are terrorist attacks on the grid that could take out substations. You also have more storms that could take out the systems. So anything we can do to build the resilience of the grid is in our industry, because in our interest and in the interest of our customers, because this is a world that you can't operate without electricity. I mean, you need it 24/7. And so the bottom line is, it's going to cost more to make the system more resilient. And this is kind of the part of the conversation that nobody likes to hear. When you're retiring and replacing all these plants, price is going to go up. If you're going to make the grid more resilient, price is going to go up. And that's inevitable. But as the prices go up, it changes the economics of the different alternatives. And at the end of the day, it's going to be incumbent upon us to make the right trade-offs, because for the entire time in our industry, we're focused on balancing affordability, reliability, and clean. And there's no perfect fuel. I mean, and y'all need, if you walk out of here with anything, any idea, any thought, walk out of here knowing there's no perfect way to generate electricity. But it's critical to the modern world. Ask the 1.2 billion people that have no access to electricity what they think about it versus the people that have access today.
There's a few straw men or women or something which have arisen during this discussion. I want to knock down a couple of them. For some reason, Mike keeps looking at me every time he uses the word regulator. Remember, I'm the ex-smoker on the panel here. I think regulation has many shortcomings as applied today. I think if I had to change one thing in this equation that we're all talking about, it would be that. And I've written several papers on this question, and I think the United States, state by state, needs seriously to take a look at the sort of system, I'm not talking about copying it, the sort of system used in the United Kingdom right now, which is known as RIIO, R-I-I-O. In fact, I think you're going to do a panel on RIIO in April here at the Brookings Institution. RIIO stands for Regulation with Incentives and Innovation Through Outputs. It's a horsey name, but that's what the Brits use for it. And it basically gives the utility a set of prices that are going to be effective for the next 8 years. They know in advance what their price is going to be. And it gives them a bunch of goals and says, knock yourselves out. Make as much money as you can with those prices. Be sure and achieve the goals we've set for you. And the goals include environmental compliance, low-income assistance. It's special to Great Britain, but that's what it is. And then the utility gets a report card every year, and their earnings go up or down a little based on how they do on that report card. And there's a decoupling mechanism in the sense the utilities are not penalized for energy efficiency activities. If we could switch to an incentive-based model in this country, you would suddenly see a lot of barriers drop. A lot of things with utilities, and by the way, Jim, I was not faulting Duke for its failure to pursue energy efficiency. But let's also agree that there are very few, count them on one hand, utilities in this country where that's a true profit center, where it's something they go after. Generally, they're complying with their regulators or their state legislators' wishes. And that's the state of the art. And there's no surprise about that. Let me throw in a couple more random things that I've been thinking about to nail down some of the points I made earlier. There are certain inexorable processes underway. We've been talking about load being flat. Let me get into that just a little bit. I don't know how many of you, I'd like to see a show of hands, have bought a refrigerator within the last 5 years. Anybody? Okay, quite a few people. I have one. It's a high-end refrigerator. It's got your ice maker and all your special stuff. Do you know what the electricity demand of that refrigerator is around the clock? Less than one of these light bulbs. It's 60 watts around the clock, and that gives you that refrigerator. That's probably a quarter of what a refrigerator was consuming 10 years ago. Everybody's got a refrigerator, and that's not changing. I replaced 25 halogen light bulbs in my house. They were each 60 watts. I replaced them with LEDs, 6 watts. Okay, doing the arithmetic, I cut my electricity use 90% in those lights, and that's not changing. These things are so efficient, they last 22 years. I gave my parents some, and she said she's putting them in her will, okay? So Mom said she's putting them in her will. All right. So those are the kinds of processes which are never going to change again back in the other direction. You add all those together, and you get electricity demand that's growing at about 1% a year at the most at a national level. Okay. All by itself, that will remake the industry. In the days of 8 and 10% year-on-year load growth, you could be pretty inconsistent, uncareful, whatever you want to say. I'm not saying anybody was, Jim, but you could be that. We no longer have that luxury any longer with these companies. A couple more small points. The amount of distributed generation has some natural ceiling. And unlike some of my environmental colleagues that I work with, I think that ceiling's a fair amount lower than they do. I think it's probably 30% or something in that range. The Brookings Institute building couldn't have a roof big enough to put solar panels to supply the load here. So there's going to be central station, large generation projects, whether they're community solar or 50 megawatts at a slug, which I think is a great model, or something else. So we're not going to all become islands unto ourselves. Don't take away from today that anybody here I don't think anybody here thinks that. So you're still going to have big actors, and let's call them, for sake of discussion, utilities. And so what we're trying to describe is the new way in which they will operate, but they're not under existential threat in the largest sense. They're going to be here. The question is, what are they going to look like and how are they going to pursue their business?
All right, I think it's time to go to the floor. We have a little more than half an hour left, so please, we'll have mics coming around. Please, as I said, please identify yourself before your question. One in the back there.
Hi, my name is Chuck Manto. I have a finance model question for you based on a parallel to the computer industry. So most of us who've been around long enough remember mainframes and IT departments, and then the emergence of the PC that gave us all our local storage as well as our local computer generation. Now we're swinging back the other way a little bit to the cloud. And so there's some kind of balancing act going on between centralized information generation and storage to local. And I'm wondering, in that same light, when you're looking at your finance model, what's the opportunity to leverage orders of magnitude more money than the utilities have by engaging individual users to do some of their own generation and storage locally in that same way that happened in the computer industry, so that part of your business becomes something akin to, say, a systems integrator, rather than the one that has to keep all that control to yourselves. And so maybe there's some kind of a balance between not only distributed generation, but the financial control that shifts from you to the user in some kind of a partnership?
I would simply say we're going to be a system integrator. The only issue is what we integrate. And I think to have the greatest productivity gains in the use of electricity, it needs to go all the way to the device and being able to balance the entire thing. And there will be a mix of central and distributed, and I think it's hard to predict. I think Ron's point about maybe 30%, that might be a good number, but it's somewhere in that zip code. But the idea of going to your customer and saying, build a distributed generation in your home, it's not affordable now. And so it's an affordability question. I mean, the gift that we have today for our country is we have some of the lowest cost power in the world. Not in all regions of the United States, I might add. Prices a little higher in New York and California. Come to North Carolina, you'd love it. Good low prices. But my point is that people are still focused on affordability. I mean, to most people in this country, we're not out of the recession yet. So they like the idea that electricity, and this is an important stat, and this is why you don't see more people concerned. Electricity is only 1.7% of the disposable income of the average family in the United States. And the other thing is, I would dare say, and I'm not going to embarrass y'all by asking you, but I've been in rooms with 400 people, and I'll say, how many of y'all know what you pay per kilowatt hour? And maybe only 2 or 3 hands go up. And then I ask them, do you know how much you pay for a gallon of gas? And every hand goes up. So people, the supply of electricity to a home is so back of mind until the power goes out. So to get them engaged, actually, it's actually a tough assignment to get them engaged in energy efficiency investments, much less building a generator in their home. Now, if our power's out a lot, that's probably an easier sell. But I think it really gets down to the economics.
Actually, I think, just to add to that, I was talking to somebody the other day, the average, again, it's all about segments of the community. So I'm talking now about people in their upper middle income area who are maybe younger technology adopters and so forth. That population, which would be a target for distributed generation, currently pays twice as much for their telephone and cable bill as they do for electricity. Yet, I think you would argue that they don't get near the value from that they do electricity. I think the affordability issue for that population is critical. Technology has to continue to evolve. The battery has to play into this in some way. And I think the lithium-ion battery will continue to come down in cost to some extent, but it's going to be a number of years before the next generation comes. I think the biggest hope for a significant penetration would be tying distributed generation in with electric vehicles and using the battery in the electric vehicle as, in effect, a backup for your photovoltaics in the home. So it's a double use of one asset, which begins to become more efficient. But without that kind of progress forward, I think you're still going to limit photovoltaics in most parts of the country to a very small number of technology adopters.
I would say the conventional wisdom in the United States has been that for electricity to be cleaner, it has to be more expensive, okay? And then all of a sudden, we were surprised, and about all policymakers and most people in the country were surprised with shale gas, because it broke that traditional thinking, because it is not only cleaner than coal, it's cheaper. And it's that kind of technological breakthrough in storage and other areas that is really going to be the driver of change in this industry. We've just got to use technology to drive the costs down so that the pricing to consumers is lower.
Ron, I know this will be heretical and out of the model for what I'm supposed to say. I'm not concerned about the price to the degree that these two gentlemen profess to be, for the following reason. Over the last 20 years across the country, across all utilities, electricity has gone up at slightly less than the rate of inflation. In real terms, that means electricity prices have been flat. I think we can afford a clean electricity future. When I was the chairman in Colorado, we moved significantly to lower carbon and to clean up other emissions of electricity. And we did that at a rate increase less than 2% compared to what it would have been if we'd stayed on the course we were on. Now, customers don't like to pay rate increases, but they don't mind it as much if they feel like they're getting something back for it. And I think there's a reservoir of demand for clean energy in this company, not only among some residential customers, but look at every hotel you go into and they brag about how much wind is in their portfolio. Or every winery now in California is becoming de rigueur, right, to have a clean energy winery, and so forth and so on. Safeway, Walmart, all of these companies. So I think there's a reservoir of demand for that. And I don't want prices 1% higher than inflation to be a barrier to us moving forward on that. So let's assess very carefully that argument about increases in prices. Now, you can go overboard, and I'm surprised Germany hasn't come up. I was expecting Jim to raise it.
I'm holding it back.
Yeah, you're holding it back. Okay. So there are ways of doing that that are wrong or would be unacceptable in this culture, but there are plenty of ways of doing it that would be right. And so that point I've made. Jim?
I was just going to say, if you buy an iPhone 5 and you compare it to the iPhone you had before, you can see the difference as a customer. If I've spent $6 billion and raised rates 6% to reduce emissions of SOx, NOx, and mercury from my plants, when you throw the switch, the lights look the same. When you turn on your TV, it turns on just the way it always turned on. So for the average customer, not the sophisticated customer, but for the average customer, they don't understand how you can raise the rates and see no change in the electricity, even though the electricity they're getting is much cleaner.
Jim, I don't agree. I think with leadership,
Boy, you ought to
can
talk to my customers.
I think with leadership, you can make that case.
There's a lady back there.
Yeah, we have a lady in the middle here. Oh, we'll get.
Yeah, I just wanted, Nina Dodge, and I work for several local associations dealing with these issues for the District of Columbia. And I just want to bring health into the equation here, and asthma, for instance. And I want to understand what kind of leadership do you think is needed to fill out the equation so we're not only looking at 30 to 80 years into the future in terms of hardware and software, but we're actually tying other societal costs to this equation. Thank you.
When I was chairman of the Colorado Public Utilities Commission, we implemented a legislative measure called Clean Air, Clean Jobs. And basically, we looked at the entire coal fleet of Xcel Energy and decided what to do with 2 gigawatts of coal generation. We made a lot of changes, lowered carbon and a lot of other criteria pollutants by about 40 to 80% in that fleet. Now, where I'm going is the 3 senior doctors at National Jewish Hospital testified before my commission and presented a huge amount of data about the impact of particulate pollution in the Denver metropolitan area from coal plants in the metropolitan area and translate that into savings, healthcare savings over the period. It was very influential in our decision to consider these other non-utility specific issues, a larger societal question. And you're helping me make a point I've been wanting to make all day long. We need to incorporate, not in any way that prejudices any fuel or anything else, but we need to bring that decision-making into the heretofore much narrower question of what does a utility need. And the question should be, what does a society need out of all of this? And then we translated into implications for utility rates.
So that takes me exactly with the process that I was talking about with our comprehensive energy plan. We had that exact testimony, and we had doctors talking about the health impacts. And you actually had people in the room, small businesses, low-income customers. When they heard that testimony, they said, yeah, you know, we do have to retrofit some of these plants. We did them ahead of when we were legally required to do it, and we had a community consensus around it because the education and knowledge was there. But, and to Ron's point, I think it's utilities' responsibility to get the knowledge out there, not only focus on the smart grid aspects, but the whole societal impact.
I should just simply say, look back over the last decade, the last 2 decades, and you've seen almost a 90% drop in SO2 in this country, a 50 to 70% drop in NOx, a reduction in mercury, a reduction in fine particulate. And the utility industry has spent billions, multiples of billions of dollars to reduce emissions. We're carrying out EPA mandates to do that, but at the end of the day, we've really cleaned up our fleet. And as I may have mentioned earlier, Duke just built 5 combined cycle gas plants and shut down 90 old coal and oil plants that reduced our emissions footprint even more. And actually, I mean, just as a footnote for the country, today, and CO2 doesn't really get to the asthma question. I have asthma, I kind of know this. But the CO2 emissions in this country, because of shale gas and technological improvements, is now at the same level as it was in 1992, even though the number of people in our country is greater and the size of our economy is much larger. So I think that, I don't think the customers or the people of the country know the amount of money that's been spent to reduce emissions that can have an adverse impact.
We have a lady about halfway down that's been very patient. Up here, can we get her a mic?
Thank you. Julia Clonis. I'm a macroeconomist and environmentalist. I appreciated greatly your discussion, very informative, but focusing, not surprisingly, to the supply side. The demand side was not mentioned, except I think Mr. Cheshire mentioned expectations or anticipation of decrease. Where I come from, we talk a lot about changes in consumer behavior in order to decrease the demand of electricity, irrespective of technological changes from the industry side. So my question is, in your prediction of decrease in the demand of electricity, do you account for what we're doing on the other side, changing consumer behavior? Or no, all more or less your predictions are based only on the supply side? Thank you.
I think the short answer is it's both behavioral changes, and we see that. I mean, we have a project in Charlotte called Envision Charlotte, where virtually all the downtown capacity of the buildings have all come together and made a commitment to reduce emissions 20% in 5 years. And that's, a lot of that is on behavior and competitiveness between the different buildings. But it's a combination of behavioral changes, you know, telling your child, turn those lights off, and technology. It's the two working together that's going to drive the demand down over time. It's not either or, it's both.
I personally feel that the days of Jimmy Carter sitting by the fireplace with a cardigan sweater asking you to turn your thermostat down is not going to get the kind of energy savings that we need. It's probably 80% of it is in the technology. The more efficient refrigerator, the more efficient air conditioners. Air conditioners today are twice as efficient as the ones most people have in their homes. So I think mostly it's the equipment efficiency is going to drive it.
I want to also mention, put in a plug for certain policy changes at the regulatory level can induce the kind of behavioral changes we're talking about. And one of them, which hasn't been mentioned today, and I know it's still a third rail in some places, is time-sensitive pricing for electricity, time of use pricing, and other kind of signals to the customer about the cost to them and to the system at certain times of the day. I think regulators who have historically been very shy about putting in time differentiated rates are beginning to see the significance of that. The flat rate pricing around the clock, around the year, is the single greatest impediment to the smart grid moving. If you had arbitrage opportunities with respect to time, and if you knew how to value generation resources with respect to time of use and the cost of the day, you get a big change in consumer behavior. And whether you want to call it behavioral change or price response, whatever you want to call it. But that's a tool that we have, to this point, neglected to use.
Anita? Mike, please.
Oh, sorry. Remarkable and important discussion, and thank you. A couple of quick questions, really. One is, it almost feels like there's an analogy here to peak oil, like we were going to run out of oil and suddenly we got too much of it, or a lot of it. And with respect to what you're describing in terms of the technological changes and all, and particularly talking about the device itself, and talking about the environmental health, et cetera, implications, I wonder if there's room here for a greater national discourse than what we have had to date, and how you would encourage that if you would. And part two, real quick, is when we're talking about technology and inputs, resource inputs, goes beyond, I think, the boundaries of the U.S. So I'm kind of wondering how, or if this is not relevant for purposes of this discussion, how that would look in terms of an international discourse on the same subject. Thank you.
Well, my nomination to FERC was an attempt at a conversation at the federal level about some of these issues. I got shouted down in talking about something which you heard Jim Rogers say today, and that is that eventually natural gas has to be cleaned up. 20 years from now, natural gas is going to inhabit about the same role that coal does today, and that is it's going to be a great fuel. It's going to be cheap in relative terms in those years, but it's going to produce too much carbon for our carbon budget. That's all I said, and of course that brought the right wing down on me in my nomination for the FERC. So yes, we do have to have a national conversation about these things. They're not actually very scary. I mean, as you've heard us sort of show all of the warts and both the promise and the warts of the system that we've got right now and where it's going. So I agree with the sentiment of your question, yes. I'll make one quick observation. I know Jim's got something to add to this on international issues. I'm a bidder, essentially in the United States program to work in Africa, the Power Africa Initiative of the administration. And it's an effort by this administration to reach out to underdeveloped countries, underdeveloped with respect to their electric grid and their capacity, their legal and regulatory capacity. So I think there is much to be done. And again, I'm not going to preempt Jim on this because he's very active in that area.
I would actually not go there, but I would pick up on the point. It's important to have a national conversation about this because you have to really separate the fact from the theology. And in the power sector and in the environmental area, there is a lot of theology. And a lot of people's positions are a function of the mix of the assets that they hold. Mm-hmm. But the change that we need in this country is at the state level. It's the state legislature that needs to change. It's the state regulators that need to change. And so a national conversation would get it, we could have a rich conversation, but I'm not sure unless we engaged the people on the state level that have the capability to change the rules, to change the regulatory model, that we'll get any real result. And with respect to I'm in the process of focusing on the 1.2 billion people that have no access to electricity. And I think it's sort of an interesting coincidence that in China, there's 1.3 billion people, and they've lifted, 99% of the people in China have access to electricity. They've probably lifted more people from poverty in a shorter period of time than any country in the history of the world. But they did it by giving them access to electricity. But unfortunately, they build a coal plant every week, and 80% of the electricity comes from coal. And so when I look at this 1.2 billion, they deserve, because the greatest inequality that exists in the world today is between those that have access to electricity and those that don't. We can't bring them electricity in the same way the Chinese brought electricity to their people. And so but they deserve access to electricity, and we need to find a way to use renewables, to use battery technologies, and maybe in the process of bringing electricity to the 1.2 billion, that there'll be some reverse innovation that will come back to the developed world to help us model our grids in a more efficient way as we experiment in those countries.
The only thing I would add, I think there is one area for a national view of our excess resources, as you were talking about. A lot of folks today that own coal-fired generation are shutting those plants down and replacing them with gas-fired generation. And that's sort of the traditional approach. But the back-of-the-envelope numbers that I've run, if we actually got serious about building efficiency, and we're able to take those buildings that were using 2 to 3 times as much as another one, you could replace the coal-fired plants that you're shutting down with energy efficiency. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't have to build those coal. Then what do we do with the excess gas generation? Well, I think it would be a higher and better use. Transportation, maybe some of the distributed district heating and cooling operations, and then maybe we could export some of this gas out into the market where it's now 3 times the cost in Europe that it is here, help our balance of payments and help their balance of payments. So I think there is a room for a national discussion about most effective allocation of resources.
Yes, sir.
Terry Hill with the Passive House Institute. Along the lines of energy efficiency in buildings, would it be possible to even think of the utilities, instead of borrowing money for new generation, they borrow money to retrofit the 130 million houses in this country?
Well, actually, Jim and I guess, were sort of the pioneers in the industry on that very concept. We both have worked out our own unique deal where we'll go to the capital markets and raise capital. So if you're a building owner, if you were to retrofit your building to high efficiency standards, it would take you about 7 years to get a payback. Well, the capital we raise, we will invest in you as a contribution, and that will take your payback down to 2 to 3 years. Now, the deal is we have to get a return on that capital just as if we were building a power plant. It's called a negawatt that we're building instead of a megawatt. But that model is there, and if it were adopted more aggressively across the country, we would cut back on a lot of the natural gas-fired generation we're having to build.
One of the things that we've said is the way to think about this is the most environmentally benign plant you can build is the one you don't build. And so that's why the investment in energy efficiency and in technologies and changing behavior is really critical to having a robust system going forward and a low-cost system.
Sir. Up here, please.
I'm Paul Kakaris, and my area is in networking, but a different kind of networking, communication networking. So I have a question, but before that I want to thank the panel for shedding several kilowatts of light onto a very complicated problem. My question has to do with regulation and the regulatory structures that we heard a lot of problems with. If I could get the panel sort of like sense of what fraction of the problem would be sort of like allocated, if you will, to the end goal that different people envision versus to problems in the transition of getting from where we are to where we all agree or don't agree to be. And if there is any mechanism of sort of like understanding what that dynamic is between transition versus end goal, I would appreciate the panel's insight. Thank you.
I would start by simply saying, first, utilities have got to embrace the future. They have to embrace the new technologies that will lead to productivity gains. They need to embrace distributed generation and kind of work through it with providers of distributed generation, and maybe they should invest it, because utilities generally have a lower cost of capital than all their customers. And that's kind of gets to Mike's point earlier. So I think to get to where we need to get, utilities have to have a mindset of embracing the future. And the regulators have got to embrace the future too and help facilitate it by changing the rules. And if it meant going to the legislature to change the rules, you need to go together, and that's to Mike's earlier discussion of a collaborative effort to make a change occur within a state to get us to that other side. But it's going to take collaboration. It's going to take a lot of work to be able to move. But at the end of the day, it's like shale gas. Technology moves swiftly, and it breaks down regulatory barriers faster than anything. So I'm a great believer that technology and innovation will force utilities as well as the regulators to change the rules and behave differently.
I would add a couple things. I think regulation presents a rather significant barrier now. It's not always the regulators, although many times it is. It's also state legislatures in some cases. In North Dakota, it is illegal for the Public Utilities Commission to consider future cost of carbon and electricity rate making, okay? Illegal. In other states, it's mandated. In Colorado, it was optional. And this notion of moving off a asset-based return model, which is what we're really talking about, instead of paying for iron in the ground, paying for results. That's the essence of what I was talking about before. That's probably going to require legislative change in some states, although in others it will not. Utilities, and there are good ones, there are great ones, and there are some pretty poor ones. They're all relatively conservative organizations. That's why their bonds are for widows and orphans, right? I mean, these were safe investments. But utilities are not known for their ability to move quickly. Jim's, I'll pick on Jim, is one who is more facile than most. But Stephen Chu told me this joke, you know, there's these 3 utility executives and they were wringing their hands over their future, and oh my gosh, how difficult is this? They decided they better end it all, so they decided to jump in front of a fast-moving object, and they jumped in front of a glacier, okay? That was their estimate of what a fast-moving object was.
God, I was loving everything you said.
And then somebody added to my joke the last time I told it, and the glacier killed him. So, Paul, I think you have a very good question, and I think we need to look. I think there's room for federal leadership on this. I do. I think Congress could do things, could sweep away certain barriers. They certainly have tried that in the past. In the Energy Policy Act of 2005. Of course, you're talking about glaciers. There's another one.
So let me just give you an example to counter this a little bit. There were some economic incentives during the recession that grants made available by the government to fund energy initiatives. I don't know if you remember that.
Sure,
City's bit.
There's lots of money.
So in Kansas City, our guys, our glacial engineers, came forward and said, look, why don't we build a smart grid, sort of a microcosm of what we're talking about here with all the different components, the self-healing aspects, the distributed controls, the demand management, electric vehicles being backed up, and let's do that in one of the lowest income areas of the city, which is called the Green Impact Zone. We partnered with Representative Cleaver to do that. And in 3 years, it's been built out. And because the regulatory model was set, I think utilities do have a chance to excite their people and create a sense of vision, a sense of momentum. But the environment under which they work and the reward systems under which they work have got to be aligned.
Mike, you're right, of course. As the Colorado Commission, we significantly increased Excel's Energy's return on energy efficiency investments, and they went from a few million to round numbers 90 million a year now inside of Colorado. You're absolutely right. And I remember talking to the general counsel about it one time after the cases were all closed. I said, is this going to do anything? He said, you throw money at us, we're going to respond to it. I mean, that was a crude way of saying regulation can provide the incentives, both positive and negative, for utilities to move quickly on these things.
But see, you were an enlightened state regulator. And I would dare say, as you look across this country, there's been a reluctance to incent utilities to make those investments, to even make the same return off those investments as they do when they invest in a power plant. That's really the impediment.
Jim, I think an important change is about to occur. I'm going to see if you agree with me on this. The EPA is looking at new rules for carbon emissions from existing plants, and they're very seriously looking at energy efficiency as a mode of compliance for utilities. I think you can fill in the blank with whichever utility you want to. Even blank will think about doing energy efficiency. I want to hear what you said. Even blank.
Filled in the blank.
We'll start thinking about energy efficiency when it becomes a compliance mechanism for EPA regulations.
Well, I'm sorry, we've run out of time, but I'm going to exercise the power of the chair to ask one final question, which I think we'd be remiss not to at least touch on. And that is, as we look towards the future electricity situation in the country, can we continue to have a situation where we have a number of states with deregulated markets and a number of states with regulated markets? And how are the two likely to fare in the changing environment that you gentlemen have been talking about this afternoon?
I'd start this by simply saying there's 19 states that have moved into the competitive market. And within one of the states that we operate in, we were one of the low-cost suppliers in the state, and what it really did is equalize the rates within the state. Our rates went above the national average, but the even higher cost utilities in the northern part of the state, their rates were equalized with us. And so what you really have is a hybrid system in the United States. We're kind of muddling along with two different kind of models. And I believe that in the competitive market, they failed to put capacity markets in. There'll be no building of new generation. You won't see the building of new nuclear plants as you see by Southern and Georgia, which is a regional effort, or in South Carolina by SCANA. You won't see, even like Duke, that built all these gas plants to shut down the coal plants. You don't see the modernization happening in the competitive market. The modernization of the generation of this country is occurring in the regulated markets, just because of the regulatory compact. And so there's some good things about the competitive market. Their development of DSM and PJM is one. But at the end of the day, I actually think we learn a lot from observing and looking back on how the rates have changed, how much emissions have changed in these regions under two different models, and then make a judgment. And I think the jury's still out, but if I was betting today, I'd bet on the vertically integrated model has produced more value and cleaner energy in a more modern system than the competitive model.
So I would observe, first of all, when this happened, the competitive states were the higher price states. They're the ones where they were losing industry, and there was a lot of pressure from industry heading down to Jim's service territory from New England and so forth. And they were saying, we got to do something to create some price pressures to help us be more competitive. My projection today would be none of the lower price states have any kind of competitive envy. You know, I don't know of a single state that say, hey, what we need to do is get more competition. We're happy that with our regulators that we've been able to keep costs under control and get the kind of innovation and get the kind of environmental responsibility. On the other hand, I think there's such an infrastructure built up around the competitive model, the PJM system and all these non-regulated companies that have political clout. I don't think they're going to slide back. So I think the hybrid model is something we're going to see going for as far as I can see into the future.
Charlie, I don't think first of all, your question is it sustainable? I think it is, basically. So much of this is local markets. I think there will be a movement towards slowly more competition in the generation market. I don't see as much progress or change in the retail markets. I think the West is going to undertake an interesting, I think, experiment of a energy imbalance market. That's not a fully competitive market, but it's kind of the first step on the way. I tend to agree with you about the Southeast. That's pretty locked in. I don't know that much is going to change there. However, depending on how hard the EPA pushes, that could scramble things quite a bit. If a lot of new, cleaner generation is going to be coming in, you might be looking to more independent power producers in those states, and that sort of puts pressure on markets. Having come from a state with vertically integrated, I know you can make significant progress when you've got alignment of the regulators and the utility and the political leadership in the state. That was the lesson from Colorado. So whatever efficiencies you waive by not having a competitive market, and you do waive some efficiencies by not having a competitive wholesale market, the others, if regulated well, I think can perform well.
Right.
Let me make one last point that I think y'all should take out of this conversation. You look across the United States, and there's significant differences in terms of access to fuel. In the South, there's no gas, there's no coal. As a consequence of that, they have been leaders in the building out of nuclear. I mean, Duke, about 50% of their electricity comes from nuclear, which is carbon-free, clean electricity. But in the Midwest, and we have operations in the Midwest, it's probably 80 to 90% coal, because all those coal plants sit in the middle of the country. And so as you look across the country, every state's different. Access to fuel is different. Regulatory regime is different. Mix of customers is different in terms of industrial Midwest and the auto industry and steel industry. And so the emphasis there is more on affordability than even clean. And so this is a far more complex story, and it's really geography driven, and there's a lot of history that reflects the geography and the differences. So there's not one size fits all, and we need to be sophisticated and nuanced in how we talk about it and the conclusions we reach for the way forward.
Well, I'd like you all to join me in thanking the speakers for a very lively session. Thanks, John.
Hey, Jim.